What happens when horror itself vanishes into the shadows of history? Imagine films buried in vaults forgotten by their makers or destroyed in studio fires only to resurface decades later as whispers of terror reborn. Between the late 50s and early 70s, entire nightmares disappeared and returned haunting a new generation. These are 18 horror movies once lost but now found restored from cinematic oblivion. Number 18. The Flesh and the Fiends, 1959. At release, this British shocker was branded too depraved for mainstream audiences. Directed by John Gilling, it told the grim tale of the Burke and Hare murders, a macabre true story of grave robbers who sold corpses to a surgeon obsessed with anatomy. The film dared to show poverty, crime, and moral decay in Edinburgh's underbelly with unflinching realism. Censors recoiled. Scenes of medical dissection were deemed too revolting, and prints were cut heavily across markets. In some countries, it never screened at all. For decades, the original uncut negative was presumed destroyed after distributor changes and archival neglect. Then, in the early 2000s, a near-complete version was found in a forgotten vault at Pinewood Studios. Restoration revealed stunning performances by Donald Pleasance and Peter Cushing, capturing the fine line between science and madness. Critics reappraised it as one of Britain's most fearless early horror dramas. Today, its rediscovery feels like a resurrection not only of a film, but of an era when moral outrage tried to erase art's darker truths and failed. Number 17. Jigoku, 1960. Jigoku from Japan's Shintoho Studios was considered the most disturbing Buddhist horror ever made. It begins like a moral parable, but spirals into a surreal descent through hell itself, where sinners face grotesque punishments beyond imagination. Director Nobuo Nakagawa fused expressionism with religious allegory, painting infernal visions that shocked post-war Japanese audiences. Censors panicked, fearing its blasphemous tone and extreme imagery. After Shintoho went bankrupt, the master negative vanished, and surviving reels circulated only in battered 16mm prints. For decades, the film's legend grew among collectors, whispered about as Japan's lost hell movie. In the 1990s, archivists located a near-pristine negative in a warehouse mislabeled as a comedy. Its restoration revealed Nakagawa's genius in full color, a phantasmagoria of guilt and salvation rarely matched since. When it returned to screens, critics called it a revelation, predicting the psychological horror that would later define Japanese cinema. Jigoku's rediscovery proved that horror can be sacred and profane at once, a mirror of every sin mankind tries to bury. Number 16. The Terror of Dr. Hitchcock, 1962. From Italy came a Gothic fever dream that terrified audiences before mysteriously vanishing. Riccardo Frida's The Terror of Dr. Hitchcock told of a Victorian surgeon obsessed with reviving his dead wife through forbidden experiments. Barbara Steele delivered one of her most haunting performances, her face the very image of obsession and guilt. The film's morbid tone and psychological perversity drew condemnation across Europe. British censors cut entire sequences, branding it unfit for human eyes. Distributors renamed and re-edited it repeatedly under titles like Raptus and The Horrible Secret of Dr. Hitchcock, fragmenting its identity until prints disappeared. For decades, collectors searched in vain until a damaged but complete negative surfaced in a private archive in Rome. After digital restoration, its color palettes and Baroque atmosphere stunned horror historians. Modern critics now call it the missing bridge between Hammer's Gothic grandeur and Italian surrealism. Its rediscovery reminds us that art once suppressed for being too strange, too morbid, or too emotional can return as prophecy. Number 15. The City of the Dead, 1960. When The City of the Dead was released in Britain, it was dismissed as a minor chiller, overshadowed by Hammer's more glamorous horrors. Yet beneath its fog-shrouded streets hid a story of witchcraft, reincarnation, and ritual sacrifice that pushed against censorship limits. Christopher Lee played a scholar investigating a cursed New England village where time itself seemed frozen by evil. In America, the film was retitled Horror Hotel and cut for television, removing scenes of human sacrifice and occult imagery. The master negative was thought lost when the distributor closed in the late 60s. For decades, fans traded grainy bootlegs, missing entire sequences. Then, in the early 2000s, a pristine print surfaced in a forgotten storage vault belonging to a defunct TV station. The restoration revealed not just atmosphere but power, the chilling stillness of Salem myths reborn through British Gothic style. Today, critics praise it as one of the earliest examples of folk horror predating The Wicker Man by over a decade. Its resurrection proved that even films buried under neglect can return to reclaim their legend. The City of the Dead teaches us that superstition never truly dies. It only waits for the fog to lift. Number 14. The Mask, 1961. The Mask was Canada's first true horror film and one of the strangest cinematic experiments of its era. Sold with the slogan, "Put on the mask if you dare," audiences were handed cardboard 3D masks to wear during specific sequences, transforming theaters into surreal participatory rituals. It followed a psychiatrist haunted by a cursed tribal mask that unleashes terrifying hallucinations filmed in eerie 3D dreamscapes. But censors were outraged by its violence and psychoanalytic undertones, claiming it promoted moral decay. After its initial release, most prints vanished as distributors folded and the 3D reels decomposed in storage. For years, it survived only through rumor and still photographs until archivists discovered a nearly complete 35mm print in the Library of Congress. The restored edition reintroduced the shocking, surreal visuals, melting faces, writhing hands, and endless corridors of fear. The Mask now stands as a relic of experimental terror that blurred art and nightmare long before modern psychedelic horror existed. Its rediscovery feels like unearthing a dream the world once tried to forget. Number 13. Carnival of Souls, 1962. Few films embody the ghostly spirit of lost cinema like Carnival of Souls. Made by industrial filmmaker Herc Harvey for almost no money, it told of a woman who survives a car crash only to drift through a ghostly version of reality haunted by pale figures calling from a deserted carnival. Upon release, it was ignored, dismissed as too strange for mainstream audiences and too low budget for art houses. Distribution collapsed, and the negatives disappeared into obscurity. Yet its images, bleak highways, abandoned fairgrounds, endless silence, stuck in the subconscious of those few who saw it. Decades later, a damaged print surfaced at a university archive. Restoration brought the film back to life, and critics were astonished. They recognized its influence on future psychological horror from David Lynch to George Romero. What once was forgotten became legend. Carnival of Souls stands as proof that horror need not scream to terrify. It only needs to whisper through time. Its rediscovery was more than preservation. It was resurrection, a ghost finding its voice again. Number 12. Night Tide, 1961. When Night Tide quietly surfaced in the early 60s, audiences didn't know what to make of it. Starring a young Dennis Hopper in one of his earliest roles, it told the melancholic story of a lonely sailor who falls in love with a mysterious woman who may, or may not, be a mermaid. Director Curtis Harrington painted Los Angeles' seedy boardwalks as dreamscapes where neon lights flickered like fading souls. Upon release, it was barely noticed. Distributors were baffled by its tone, too poetic for horror, too eerie for romance. Prints were mishandled, and by the 70s, most had deteriorated or vanished completely. For years, it survived only as fragments shown in late-night television slots under alternate titles. Then, a miracle occurred. A complete negative was found in the vaults of the Academy Film Archive during a reorganization in the 90s. Restored in crisp monochrome, the film revealed haunting textures and Hopper's raw vulnerability long before Easy Rider made him a counterculture icon. Critics finally understood its brilliance. It was not merely a monster story, but a fragile meditation on loneliness and desire for connection in a world that feels half asleep. Night Tide was reborn as one of the most atmospheric American independent horror films ever made. Its rediscovery was like seeing moonlight after decades of fog, soft, quiet, and eternal. Number 11. The Sadist, 1963. The Sadist was based loosely on the real-life Starkweather killing spree and became one of the most disturbing low-budget horrors of the 60s. It starred Arch Hall Jr. as a baby-faced psychopath terrorizing stranded teachers at a desert junkyard. Shot with gritty realism and handheld tension, it was an early blueprint for slasher cinema years before the term existed. At the time, audiences recoiled. Its violence and nihilism were considered too extreme even for drive-ins. Distributors dropped it after limited screenings and television stations refused to air it. The negatives were lost during the bankruptcy of Fairway International Pictures, and for decades, it was believed destroyed. Then, in the late 80s, a collector found a full 35mm print inside a storage locker in Los Angeles. The restoration revealed stunning cinematography by Vilmos Zsigmond, who would later win an Oscar for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. His work turned a simple thriller into a psychological inferno. When reissued, critics hailed it as a missing link between noir fatalism and modern horror brutality. The sadist's rediscovery felt like a confession from the past, an acknowledgement that America's innocence had always been an illusion. It remains a masterpiece that looked too long into the darkness and was buried for daring to tell the truth. Number 10. Lemora, A Child's Tale of the Supernatural, 1973. When Lemora premiered, it instantly provoked controversy. Marketed as a gothic fairy tale, it followed a young girl who ventures into a decaying village ruled by a vampire priestess. Beneath its dreamlike surface lay themes of corruption, faith, and innocence. Director Richard Blackburn created a surreal world that felt both biblical and nightmarish, filmed through a fog of decay. Religious groups attacked it, calling it blasphemous and immoral. Censors demanded heavy cuts before limited release, and critics dismissed it as exploitation. The prints disappeared soon after due to distribution collapse and legal disputes. By the late 70s, it had almost entirely vanished, known only to a handful of collectors who whispered about its strange power. In the 90s, a pristine print emerged from a private archive in Texas, allowing full restoration. What resurfaced stunned cinephiles, a hypnotic mood piece blending Southern Gothic horror and fever dream surrealism. Modern critics call it one of the most misunderstood American horrors of its decade. Its rediscovery reframed it not as cheap shock, but as tragic poetry, a story about lost innocence and forbidden knowledge. Lemora proved that even the films condemned for their daring could rise again, transformed into timeless allegory. Its return was not just cinematic recovery, but spiritual redemption. Number 9. The Witches, 1966. Before Hammer's horror queens or Italian witchcraft sagas, there was The Witches, an eerie British film that audiences never truly understood when it arrived. Produced by Hammer and adapted from Nora Lofts' novel, it starred Joan Fontaine in her final leading role as a traumatized teacher who takes a new post in a sleepy village, hiding sinister pagan secrets. Though shot with class and atmosphere, The Witches bewildered both critics and censors. Its slow psychological unraveling and shocking finale, featuring ritual sacrifice, were deemed too unorthodox for the Gothic market. It flopped, then vanished. Television prints circulated briefly before vanishing entirely during Hammer's catalog transitions. For decades, it survived only through degraded copies, missing its most disturbing sequences. In the 2000s, Hammer's archive restoration project unearthed the original negatives locked away in mislabeled reels. What emerged was a revelation, a bold and modernist story about fear of female independence wrapped inside occult horror. Fontaine's performance now feels prophetic, portraying repression and hysteria in post-war England with nuance far beyond its era. The Witches reclaimed its identity as one of Hammer's lost experiments, a film not of monsters, but of collective madness. Its resurrection reminds us that sometimes the scariest evil hides beneath politeness and prayer. Number 8. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. Let's Scare Jessica to Death was one of those fragile American horrors that defied definition. It told of a woman recovering from mental illness, retreating to a rural farmhouse where whispers of vampirism, isolation, and insanity blend into one unnerving hallucination. Released quietly, it confused audiences expecting blood and monsters. Instead, they found silence, melancholy, and ambiguity. Critics dismissed it as too slow, and distributors mishandled the marketing. The film faded quickly, and when the studio folded, the negatives went missing. Bootlegs circulated for years, each missing key scenes from the haunting original cut. Then, archivists at Paramount discovered complete reels in the early 2000s during a film transfer project. The restored version exposed its brilliance, a psychological folk horror drenched in dread, decades before that term existed. Modern filmmakers hail it as an influence from Ari Aster to Robert Eggers. Its rediscovery redefined it not as a forgotten oddity, but as one of the most haunting depictions of madness and alienation ever filmed. Let's Scare Jessica to Death teaches that horror does not always scream. It whispers softly until you begin to doubt your own mind. Number 7. Tombs of the Blind Dead, 1972. From Spain came one of the strangest cinematic legends ever lost. Armando de Osorio's Tombs of the Blind Dead. The film introduced the terrifying Knights Templar, reanimated corpses of excommunicated monks who rise from their graves to drink the blood of the living. It became an international sensation, yet its censorship story was chaos. Versions were butchered across Europe, cutting violence and religious imagery. In America, distributors re-edited it into a nonsense version called Revenge from Planet Ape, adding fake sci-fi narration to exploit Planet of the Apes mania. The original negative disappeared soon after. For years, horror fans hunted rumors of an uncut Spanish version. Then, in 1998, a 35mm inner negative was found in Lisbon, mislabeled under its English pseudonym. Restoration finally allowed audiences to experience its full nightmare, the slow-motion horsemen rising from fog-shrouded ruins under the sound of tolling bells. Critics now see it as a cornerstone of European horror, influencing everything from Italian zombie films to Gothic revival. Its rediscovery returned dignity to a movie once mutilated beyond recognition. Tombs of the Blind Dead reminds us that horror never truly dies. It just sleeps in the crypt until the world is ready to fear again. Number 6. The Sorcerers, 1967. Before Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange explored mind control, Michael Reeves had already gone there with The Sorcerers. This British psychological horror starred Boris Karloff in one of his final truly great performances as a scientist who invents a device that lets him and his wife experience other people's sensations. Their chosen subject, an aimless young man, soon becomes their puppet of pleasure and violence. Upon release, The Sorcerers shocked critics but failed commercially. The concept of psychic voyeurism felt too disturbing for the 60s audience, still obsessed with swinging London optimism. Censors demanded edits to its morally ambiguous finale, and distributors lost faith. When the director died shortly after making Witchfinder General, the film faded from circulation. For decades, it was considered partially lost. Television versions were cropped and color-faded, missing entire scenes of emotional breakdown. But in 2009, a pristine 35mm negative surfaced in a private collection belonging to Karloff's estate. A full restoration followed, revealing the eerie color palette and hypnotic editing that predated later body horror themes. Modern critics hail it as a philosophical horror film far ahead of its time. Beneath its thriller surface lies a parable about media addiction and lost identity, how the urge to feel through others can consume the soul. Its rediscovery restored Reeves's reputation not just as a genre craftsman, but as one of Britain's great lost visionaries. The Sorcerers came back from obscurity as a chilling warning about voyeurism decades before it defined modern society. Number 5. Messiah of Evil, 1973. Messiah of Evil is one of those rare American nightmares that feels like it came from another planet. Directed by Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz before their success with American Graffiti, this surreal horror tells of a young woman searching for her missing father in a California coastal town, overrun by nocturnal cultists who worship a dark god from the sea. When it premiered, regional distributors didn't know how to market it. It was too artful for drive-ins, too nightmarish for mainstream release. Prints circulated under false titles like Dead People or Return of the Living Dead, and soon vanished into the fog of forgotten cinema. The directors themselves believed the negative destroyed after years of re-edits and bankruptcies. Then a 35mm print surfaced in 1998 inside an abandoned storage facility in New Orleans. Restoration unveiled its hypnotic sound design and eerie color compositions. Half dream, half decay. The film's grocery store massacre sequence now ranks among horror's most poetic moments. Critics reappraised it as one of the lost masterpieces of American horror, part surrealist cinema, part Lovecraftian fable about small-town rot. Its rediscovery gave voice to a generation of filmmakers who saw horror not as cheap thrills, but as modern myth. Messiah of Evil rose again as a haunted mirror of alienation and artistic freedom suffocated too soon. Number 4. Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. When Blood on Satan's Claw first appeared, it confused everyone. Part historical horror, part folk parable, it told of a 17th century village descending into madness when demonic relics are unearthed from the soil. Children grow wild, priests doubt their faith, and hysteria consumes the countryside. Director Piers Haggard created a vision of rural evil unlike anything British audiences had seen, but its combination of pagan horror and moral decay unsettled censors. Scenes of possession and corruption were heavily cut. The studio Tygon Pictures mishandled distribution after Hammer's dominance overshadowed smaller companies. Prints were chopped and retitled. For years, only a truncated television version survived its once haunting cinematography, reduced to grainy shadows. In the late 90s, film archivists discovered a nearly complete negative, preserved by accident in a private collection. When restored, its pagan landscape and mournful music stunned new viewers. Modern critics recognized it as one of the defining works of British folk horror alongside Witchfinder General and The Wicker Man. Blood on Satan's Claw is more than a film. It is an ancient fear rediscovered. It shows how superstition infects entire communities when faith begins to crumble. Its return reminded audiences that horror often speaks through forgotten rituals waiting centuries to be seen again. Number 3. Eyes Without a Face, 1960. When Georges Franju released Eyes Without a Face, it was unlike anything the world had seen. This French horror told of a brilliant surgeon driven to madness by guilt. After disfiguring his daughter in an accident, he kidnaps women to remove their faces, hoping to restore hers. Beneath its Gothic poetry was something profoundly human, grief wearing a mask of science. But the film's quiet surgical horror shocked audiences. During its premiere in Edinburgh, fainting was reported. British censors declared it obscene for its graphic medical scenes and moral ambiguity. Distributors withdrew it quickly. In America, it was butchered under the new title, The Horror Chamber of Dr. Faustus, stripped of its haunting tone and reduced to pulp. The original negative vanished in studio transfers. For decades, only cropped dubs existed, until archivists in France located the uncut version in the Cinémathèque Française vault in 1997. The restoration revealed a film not of gore, but sorrow, a meditation on obsession, guilt, and lost innocence. Today, critics call it one of the greatest horror films ever, made a bridge between classic and modern terror. Its rediscovery proved that horror could be beautiful, even tragic. Eyes Without a Face returned like a ghost seeking forgiveness, reminding us that behind every mask lies a fragile plea to be seen. Number 2. The Innocents, 1961. Jack Clayton's The Innocents was an exquisite ghost story that terrified quietly. Adapted from Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, it followed a governess who suspects her charges are possessed by the spirits of dead servants. Deborah Kerr's performance as the tormented guardian was mesmerizing, part hysteria, part repression, part spiritual despair. Yet upon release, The Innocents confounded critics. It was too subtle for horror fans and too haunting for drama purists. Some countries demanded cuts for its psychological intensity and ambiguous implications. Box office results were disappointing, and for decades, prints deteriorated, leaving only faded television transfers. In the late 90s, a miracle occurred. 20th Century Fox archivists discovered original negatives in perfect condition, sealed in a mislabeled canister. The restoration unveiled its breathtaking black and white cinematography by Freddie Francis, whose use of deep focus and shadow created visual poetry. Modern audiences finally understood its genius, a film about perception, truth, and buried sin. The Innocents was not lost simply because of neglect, but because it dared to whisper where others screamed. Its rediscovery redefined Gothic cinema, proving terror can live in silence. The film's return feels like a seance completed, a story that refused to die until it was finally believed. Number 1. The Wicker Man, 1973. Perhaps no horror film's disappearance was more tragic or more legendary than The Wicker Man. Robin Hardy's pagan masterpiece told of a devout police sergeant arriving on a remote Scottish island to search for a missing girl. What he finds is a society ruled by ancient rituals, fertility cults, and the seductive power of belief. When first screened, studio executives panicked. It was too strange, too pagan, too political. They demanded heavy cuts, slashing over 15 minutes of essential footage. The mutilated version was dumped as a B feature beneath "Don't Look Now," then quickly withdrawn. The original negative was reportedly used as landfill under a motorway. For years, fans believed the full film gone forever. Then, in 1979, a near-complete print was found in the vaults of Roger Corman's company in Los Angeles. The recovered scenes transformed the film's meaning, its tragedy deeper, its imagery grander. Later restorations added lost moments of song and ritual, turning myth back into prophecy. Today, The Wicker Man stands as one of the most celebrated rediscoveries in cinema history. Its return wasn't just archival triumph. It was cultural resurrection. A film once burned now burns brighter than ever, a reminder that the truth may be buried, but it always rises through the flames. So many nightmares were buried beneath time, censorship, and neglect, yet all return to haunt us again. Each rediscovery is a resurrection, proof that stories refuse to stay dead. Which of these lost horrors shocked you most? Tell us below and keep these ghosts alive. Like, subscribe, and join us as we resurrect cinema's forgotten terrors once more.